On what day did God create the heavens and the earth? On what day did God create the heavens and the earth?
That's funny because I
know,
just
in the
listened. I just
beginning.
listened to the debate like today, so it's like,
I mean, I would say like probably on day one, because in the beginning is what makes my brain think that that's the beginning of time. That's what probably if I were to read it right now, that's what I would say.
That's what you'd say, Seth, too?
yeah, day one.
Okay, right. So, and a lot of people would say day one. So, do you think that the day one starts with "and God said"? Each of the days, right? And God said, and there was evening and morning.
Yeah.
And God said, there's evening and morning.
Mm-hmm. That was the only one that didn't have that.
It didn't.
What was your question again? Do I think the first day starts with?
On what day? On what day did God create the heavens and the earth?
So it'd be day 0. I don't
know. Day -1.
Day -1.
Well,
I'm not
the text
sure.
just says.
Yeah. I'm not trying not to cheat. Yeah. What the text is. Yeah. I feel like I'm doing what I said other people do, but I would go back to Sunday school and well, it seems like day 1.
Yeah, and the text just says, right, in the beginning.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was void and formless. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God hovered over the waters, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then God said, let there be light, and he separated the light from the darkness, right?
Mm-hmm.
So then doesn't it sound like he creates the heavens and the earth before day one?
Yeah. We found your.
I was stunned.
Yeah, to me, it sounds like that.
I was stunned when I decided to study the subject. I was like, oh, let me open up my Bible and read it. And I just read those first 2 verses and was just like, oh my gosh, what? Now, and I'm just saying, like, on a plain, literal reading of the text, that's the way it seems. Without even a great deal of further analysis. Now, there's a whole lot more to be said about it, but it's like, okay, that's kind of how it seems to start. And so then it's like, okay, well, now let's go through these 6 days of creation, right? And it's like, boom, 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 boom. And what do I see? It's like, I see patterns. You should interpret a text according to its literary structure. Okay? Right?
Yep.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And it's like, if Genesis 1 has a literary structure, what is it? What is it? And this was essentially part of my argument during my debate that I did with Matt, the Apologeti. And it's like, well, yeah, there seems to be this, and God said, and then it ends with there's evening and morning. And that occurs 6 times. So that's 6. But if I start in verse 1, it breaks that pattern. Right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Because then day 1 would be completely different.
Mm-hmm.
So then I should see if there are any other patterns. And there are a bunch of word patterns. So for instance, God said occurs 10 times. According to the kinds, that occurs 10 times. Right? So there's all these different things that are starting to match up, and it's like, well, this is sounding weird. And so, like, for instance, the numbering part, right? Here's a further question for you. And this is part of my point about other young earth creationists just not even knowing the text.
Mm-hmm.
Why isn't day 2 good? Of all the days of creation, why is day 2 not good? Because it doesn't say that day 2 is good. Every day is said to be good except for day 2. And it's like, well, what's your explanation? Right?
Mm-hmm. Right.
And
I'd ask
most
Adam
people-
from Curious Christian to tell me.
Yeah. So like to me, this is a huge detail that I'm just saying is like it's just part of the text. Like this is just a fact of the text, right? And that's what I mean is like, okay, wait, you're all interpreting the text, you don't even know what it says, you know? And so I'm just saying like the bare minimum, we should get all the facts and then start to add them up and then start to say things. So part of this is the point of like, oh, well, if you want to interpret a text, you should try and see what's in there before trying to interpret it. So the reason is because good is mentioned 7 times. And 7 is the number of completion. And therefore, because it is 7, it is trying to declare that all of the days are good.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Had they mentioned it 8 times, then it'd be like, oh, okay, so there are 8 things that are good. Right? Instead of everything being good. Same thing with according to the kinds. Are there only 10 things that are according to their kind? Probably not. But since it is 10, it is a completeness, all according to the kinds. So it's starting to show these different patterns. And likewise, days 1 through 3 end up matching up with days 4 through 6. And it's like, oh, well, that works only if you don't include the first 2 verses. Only if you don't include the first 2 verses of the text. Then days 1 through 3 match with days 4 through 6. So look, on the first 3 days, separation of light and darkness, separation of waters above and the waters below, separation of the water from the lands, and then plants on there. And then days 4 through 6, right? Sun, moon, and stars seem to match with the light and the darkness. Mm-hmm. The birds of the air and the birds and the sea creatures match with the waters above and the waters below. And then the land and the plants match with the animals and mankind. Mm. So it's like, well, wow, there's another literary structure. Right? But then again, the first 2 verses seem like a summary statement, right? Mm-hmm. Where it's like, oh, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth is void and formless, darkness over the surface of the deep, the Spirit of God hovers over the waters, right?
Yeah.
So what do we learn in anything? Context. We should interpret stuff according to context, right?
Yep.
So why is it that the 6 days of creation are all calling back to verse 2? Void, like emptiness, darkness. Why does God create light on the first day?
Come on, Seth, you have the answer.
I don't.
I just gave you the answer. It's at verse 2.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a callback to verse 2.
Because there's darkness over the surface of the deep. Right? So verse 3, the first day of creation is calling back to the darkness, and then he's separating the waters, right? Oh, formlessness and void, right? Oh, wait. If you're separating stuff, what are you doing? You're giving it form. Right? You're separating the waters, you're shaping it, you're molding it, right? Mm-hmm. And then it's like, oh, days 4, 5, and 6. Oh, what are you doing? Oh, it's void and formless, right? So it's empty and formless, right? What is he doing? Oh, you're filling in the gaps. Here come land animals. Here come, birds and sea creatures. And then comes man. Right? So I'm just saying, like, on a very straightforward hermeneutic and Bible study process that I learned in school, and through reading books, like, it's like, well, that makes lots of sense to me, without doing too many gymnastics. You don't need to read any ancient Near Eastern material to just go like, oh, like I can see that. And I can see those connections, right?
And that connection and that conclusion is that, at least from your debate, you were saying that from this reading of Genesis, it's agnostic towards the age of the earth. Is that correct?
That's right. It's agnostic because verse 2 establishes that there is a material creation prior to day 1. The 6 days of creation, they're all calling back to verse 2, right? So if there's already earth and water and all of this stuff
Right.
before day 1, that must mean there was a material creation prior to day 1 of the 6 days of creation. Therefore, you cannot know how old the earth is because it doesn't tell you when that physical raw material was created.
And so I'd love you to play devil's advocate for those that say, well, no, the earth is young. What are some of the most common arguments that you run into? Is it the genealogies that track back? I've seen, I mean, this was kind of brought up in your debate, but Mark 10:6, I think it's brought up a lot. Christ referring to in the beginning, they were male and female, things of that nature. What are some of the most common arguments that you run into that refute this or attempt to refute this agnostic perspective on Genesis 1?
Yeah. So one, this is definitely new arguments that I'm bringing forward. So I haven't really had too many attempts to some degree. But let me give you a few of the major arguments out there. So in the ones that were brought up during the debate, one is Mark 10:6. To be really blunt, I have no idea why this one is brought up. I really don't understand it as an argument at all. Like to say like, oh, in the beginning, God created, like, especially going against my view, like it does absolutely nothing. So to say like, oh, Adam and Eve were created in the beginning. Okay, cool. Are you saying they were created on day 1? Like, what are you saying?
Yeah.
Right. I mean, everyone knows, nobody believes they're created on day 1. They're created on day 6 at like a minimum. So it's like, if they're created on day 6, but I'm saying that the earth existed before day 1 of the 6-day creation account, then how does that supposed to affect this? I don't understand. Right. So it just doesn't make any sense to me. It's like, oh, they're created in the beginning. Okay, well, the beginning in this case is obviously referring to the 6-day creation account. And all of my arguments show that the creation of the earth precedes day 1. Okay, so I don't think that one works. Exodus 20. This was probably the biggest contention in our debate. Exodus 20, which talks about the Sabbath day. And it's like, oh, for in 6 days, the Lord made the heavens and the earth and the seas and all that are in them. And it's like, okay, cool. But why wouldn't you think, doing back to biblical studies and hermeneutics, right? My opponent was trying to say that you should interpret Genesis in light of Exodus 20. Why? That's backwards. You would always interpret Genesis 20 according to or detailed full account, which is Genesis 1. And so if my interpretation is correct, then you should understand Exodus 20 is referring to the 6 days of creation, like it's espousing, and the 6 days of creation, what it means when it says, oh, God created the seas, is that he separated the waters. That's what it means. And so that's what it's referring to, but it's not talking about the material creation of the seas, right? He's talking about the creation of it from that which was already there. And so, yeah, again, Exodus 20 doesn't do anything against my arguments because they're presupposing, they're begging the question to say that Exodus 20 works. In order to say that Exodus 20 works, they have to presuppose that their view is correct. But since I'm arguing about the very thing in question, you can't simply assert that Exodus 20 works. You have to show me from Genesis that it works. So, so you've got those ones. Now, the strongest argument, in my opinion, the only one, there's a few other arguments that you can go. Well, I'll mention the one other one. One is, so for them to kind of say that Genesis 1 and 2 is a summary statement. Okay, so it's a summary statement. and that it's referring to it's referring to all this this stuff is like, oh, not really being real. So it's to say it's like Genesis 1 and 2 isn't something that actually happens. It's just kind of summing up what's going on during the 6 days of creation, right?
Mhm.
And so it's like, okay, but here's the problem. If it's not real, if there is no earth, waters, and the earth and waters are not void and formless, then why do the rest of the chapters presuppose it? So, for example, on what day, I know, it's asking you guys so many questions. On what day does God create water?
Day 0.
Well, I mean, the water was already there. Yeah, in the first
Yeah,
day
it's already there. Yeah.
So, yeah, I would say we can't exactly know exactly what day.
Yeah, because it has to already be there. So if it's a summary statement that isn't talking about anything actually real, then you don't have any water. It doesn't make any sense of the rest of the chapter, because the rest of the chapter is presupposing that that's already there, right?
Yeah.
It doesn't make sense of the separating the light and the darkness. It doesn't make sense of separating the waters. Separating the waters from what? There's nothing there. Like, what are you talking about? So it has to be there. So I think that ultimately the best try is to say that the first 2 verses are part of day 1, right?
Mhm.
But I think that this doesn't work as far as like an actual deep study, because all of the rest of the days, like I said, match days 1 through 6, only if you start with verse 3. But it completely separates and breaks all of the patterns if you include the first 2 verses, right? And then actually on the deeper points, and I know, but I'm just going to bring it up a little bit, but it's the Hebrew grammar. So the Hebrew grammar has something called what's called a vav consecutive. And what it does is it helps, it's a little thing in there that kind of connects sequences of events. And so the first vav consecutive, it shows up in verse 3. All right. So it kind of begins there with God said, and then it continues throughout days 1 through 6. Now, the point here is this. It creates a grammatical barrier from connecting the first 2 verses with verse 3. You can't really connect those two as the first 2 verses being part of the sequence. The beginning of the sequence starts in verse 3 and only then continues on. And so you can see this structure in the Hebrew, that there's a vav consecutive, and the consecutive is continually tying these actions and these events together, but it's not there in the first 2 verses. So it's still a separation there. So I think for all of the reasons, yeah, these connect.
I was going to say, how do you respond to another potential argument, which is, referring to church history or historical understandings of Genesis? Is that one that, I know you mentioned, like, you took a very solid approach, let's just interpret scripture. How do you respond to the people that say, well, this has been the plain or understood reason historically of Genesis?
Yeah. Number one, I'm not Catholic. So
Fair.
no, I'm serious. Like,
Yeah.
I find
Yeah.
this to be awfully surprising how often I do get like, what about church history arguments concerning different parts of work that I've done? And like, well, I don't see this in church history. And I'm like, I'm not Catholic. I mean, just to be blunt, like to a large degree, like scripture is my final authority is number one. Number two, my understanding is that's just not true. It's just not true. So if you do go back, yeah, there are other people that have had different views. I've asked some, Jewish guys too, like, hey, what's the thought been behind this? And he's like, this has always been a discussion and argument amongst Judaism. Like this has gone back for long time. And so to me, the fact is that if you go back and just like, oh, well, what has Judaism thought about this? And it's not been the traditional only 6,000 year view. Then okay, like it's just not true. It's kind of a talking point that other people have brought up. Oh, this has always been the classic understanding. it's false. So I just reject the claim. And then the major thing is just that it's like, yeah, well, did some people have that view? Sure. And did some people speculate and think like, oh, well, this is probably the biggest thing there is? Sure. But how many other people have actually counted all of the years from Genesis to Revelation? Not that many. Yeah, so it's really an argument that, especially if you're a Protestant, I just don't think holds water, number one, because scripture is primary. And then number two, yeah, like upon investigation, I just don't think it works.
Yeah.
So good old IP, good old Inspiring Philosophy. He's got some great content on this and Young Earth Creationist movement and kind of how it all came about. So.